Hello and welcome back to my 10 favorite people. Hope you're doing well. I'm incredibly excited for today's video for two reasons. For one, global liquidity is finally back in an uptrend while Bitcoin is consolidating and resetting sentiment, and this is exactly what we want to see. And the second reason is that I finally launched a free community where I'm hosting all of my charts and TradingView templates. So if you want access to those and you want to join the conversation, feel free to access that in the video description. But as for Bitcoin and global liquidity, I know there's a lot of fear out there right now, as we can clearly see in the crypto fear and greed index, now officially deep in the fear region with a reading of 35. But the crazy thing is that we've seen this exact same pattern play out 3 times already this cycle, and I don't believe this time is different. Back towards the end of the bear market, we started seeing a recovery in global liquidity, but Bitcoin was still chopping and consolidating sideways, and many investors were fearful that Bitcoin was still going to roll over and head to 12K. In late 2023, we saw global liquidity begin recovering, but Bitcoin was chopping and consolidating sideways, and many investors were worried that the grayscale unlocks were going to lead to a much deeper correction back to around 30K. And even as recent as Q3 of last year, we saw global liquidity begin its recovery, but Bitcoin kept chopping sideways, and there were many people waiting for Bitcoin to retest 40,000, or there were even people calling for the cycle already being over. And here we are once again today with global liquidity beginning its recovery, and Bitcoin is consolidating sideways, and many investors are calling for cycle tops and giving up hope because of the chop and consolidation. And it makes sense that this market is getting more and more fearful as Bitcoin goes sideways, because we're clearly seeing a lot of capitulation in altcoins. Investors have been promised over and over again each and every month that alt season is around the corner and this is going to be a meme super cycle, but we have just not seen that play out. There's also a lot of fear surrounding the US-China trade war situation, and is it going to send Bitcoin below 90K and cause a correction in stocks? There's also a lot of concerns that the market is going to take another 2 months to recover if we see the 2022 pattern play out, and it takes the market a while to digest the capitulation event we saw recently. And a lot of this sentiment reset is coming from Bitcoin's choppy price action, where we see everybody pile into these false breakouts just to have Bitcoin fall back into the range. Everybody starts panic selling during a false breakdown just to have Bitcoin recover back into the range. False breakout once again, everybody panics in, and then we get back in the range, and then we come back to the range low with all the tariff concerns. Everybody gets concerned and panic sells just for Bitcoin to trade back into the range. And the longer this goes on, the more leverage traders get wrecked, the more altcoins bleed, and the more fearful the market gets that perhaps the cycle top could be in. And we see this very clearly in the volatility data. Bitcoin has now hit a record low in volatility, which makes sense because the larger and more established an asset gets, the smaller you'd expect both the rallies and the corrections to be. And this is definitely what we've seen so far this cycle. And this is exactly why I called Monday's weekly report the Great Reset. We're seeing so many investors throw in the towel and turn fearful while Bitcoin just consolidates, and we're seeing more and more regulatory clarity, and we're seeing a better and better macro backdrop for Bitcoin. So we'll keep an eye on global liquidity. Obviously, if it rolls over aggressively here, we're going to have to reassess. But as of right now, I think it's going to continue grinding higher. We are seeing very clear signs of weakness in the US dollar index, which is one of the main drivers of global liquidity. We're seeing a similar lower high structure to what we saw in late 2023 before Bitcoin began its last major uptrend. But a lot of that is going to depend on what ends up happening with the economic data, and we're going to keep an eye on these Fed rate cut expectations. Right now, the market is only pricing in 2, and I don't believe that's going to be enough. I do expect the labor market to start weakening, and we do have a very important unemployment rate print tomorrow, and we know that inflation has been stubborn, but at least it's not continuing higher. So I think it's going to be harder and harder for the Fed to continue justifying keeping rates this elevated, because a strong dollar is not really good for anybody, whether it's the US or the global economy. So we'll see what happens. Maybe we chop and consolidate for another week or two, or maybe it ends up taking a little bit longer, but I don't think we've seen the high yet for this cycle. We know that the FTX creditors are going to start receiving their cash on February 18th, and I don't think the market is going to give them a steep discount to buy back in. We're also seeing a huge turnaround in the regulatory backdrop with the SEC scaling back their crypto enforcement unit. We're also seeing the CFTC acting chair saying the agency is ending their regulation by enforcement. We're seeing all of these discussions on the US wanting to bring stablecoins onshore, and we know this is one of crypto's best use cases. It's actually my main bull case for my Ethereum and Solana holdings. I think stablecoins are going to continue to be huge, and I think the popularity is going to skyrocket now that the government is actually making it easier to issue them with a better regulatory framework. We're seeing stablecoin bills being introduced to help facilitate that. We're still seeing states talking about Bitcoin strategic reserves. And again, even if these things don't happen, or even if it's a few states, I have a very hard time seeing Bitcoin putting in a macro cycle top while all of these great developments haven't even taken place yet. And last but certainly not least, MicroStrategy is rebranding to Strategy B and adopts the Bitcoin logo. I'm not really sure what the thought process of this is, but pretty entertaining and intriguing nonetheless. But I remain quite optimistic on Bitcoin over the next few months. Could we see a decent sized pullback? Of course. Could there be a huge macro surprise that causes a bigger shakeout? Of course. Could we revisit the low 70,000s or high 80,000s to really capitulate people out of the market and flush out all of the leverage before our next move higher? Maybe that would also coincide with us filling the Bitcoin CME gap, but I'm not convinced that has to happen before our next move higher. And as for my portfolio, still pretty cash heavy and still holding the big three. Honestly, I'm pretty tempted to buy more Ethereum at these prices, but because I'm already quite Ethereum heavy compared to my Bitcoin position, I'm not really that tempted to add more Ethereum because I already have quite a decent bit of exposure. So we'll see how that ends up playing out, because I have a very hard time buying Bitcoin at these prices, and I'd rather just sit on my existing positions and take small profits along the way whenever we put in new highs. Ethereum's performance has been quite a painful sight to behold, and I'm hoping that perhaps that was our last major liquidation event and flush out. We really don't want to start closing weekly candles below our 200-week moving average, but as of right now, we are holding above that level. And surprisingly, we are seeing an increase in ETF inflows for Ethereum after that event. Now, one day of inflows isn't enough. We want to see slow and steady inflows starting to come in. Perhaps some staking ETFs will allow that to start, but as of right now, it's nice to see some demand stepping in at these prices. As for Solana, also struggling as well, but we have some time before the weekly close. We really want to maintain this trend we've had above the 20-week moving average ever since the election in November. We have traded below it during this bull market, but that would end up resulting in a much longer chop and consolidation period. So ideally, we would close this week above $200, but we're going to have to wait for the weekly close and see how that plays out. But the fundamentals on Solana still look quite good. We saw app revenues increase by 200% in Q4 of last year alone, and that was before Trump launched his meme coin last month. So I do think Solana still has a bright future, and it is my main hedge to the languishing of Ethereum that we've seen over the past few years. So I enjoy holding both of them in my portfolio. And of course, a lot of their price action is going to depend heavily on what Bitcoin does. And as of right now, it seems like chop and consolidation is the most likely outcome for this market. As for traditional markets, still no changes there. Maybe tomorrow's unemployment rate print could be a catalyst for the S&P 500, but as of right now, it's just been chopping around and digesting all of these Trump executive orders and the tariff conversations. So still waiting for it to break out in either direction. We are seeing an ever so slight divergence between Bitcoin and the S&P 500 right now, so we'll see which one ends up leading the way and which one ends up following, but I still think more chop and consolidation is the base case for both. But as we look forward, the future still looks bright. The federal government is still running huge deficits. That trend doesn't seem to be changing anytime soon, even though Elon and Doge are taking the first steps. And as long as the national debt increases, I expect the money supply to increase alongside it, which is bullish for our risk assets like the S&P 500 and bullish for our fixed supply risk assets like Bitcoin. And as always, let me know what you expect. Is this the beginning of a new uptrend for global liquidity, or is this just a bounce before it rolls over? Would love to hear from you and know what you expect. Feel free to join the community if you're interested in my chart templates and want to join the conversation. And as always, thank you so much for the support on the recent videos. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll talk to you soon.